everyone. Nice to see everyone here today. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah, someone give me a thumbs up if you can hear. Cool. Excellent. So thank you all for joining us today. In case you don't know, I'm JT. I'm the community manager at No Code Founders. And today we are lucky, very lucky to be joined by Lola Jabawali, who is one of the original voices in the no code space. She runs an agency called Lunch Pail Labs. She also runs a podcast called Lunch Pail Daily, and she also runs a integrations directory with over 800 integrations that lets you navigate the no-code ecosystem and see what tools integrate with each other. So she is a great person to be speaking to about integrations. So thank you for joining us. Today's session is going to be a high-level overview of integrations, where to find them, how to use them with one another, and it's going to be a fairly open session, so Lola has a few slides to start with, but if anyone has questions along the way, feel free to jump in or drop them in the chat, and I will field the questions from there. So I will pass over to Lola. Thank you, Lola.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Super excited to jam with you all. Okay, okay, cool. And I can share my screen. Can everyone hear me okay and see my screen? Everyone see my screen?
Yep. I'm okay.
Awesome.
Okay.
I can't see anybody else, but that's okay. So if you do, I cannot see you all, but if you do have any questions, just feel free to like unmute, or Joshua too, like you can as well, just like pop in and be like, hey, there's a question, and I'll start answering the question.
Cool.
But hello and welcome everyone. Welcome to, I guess, like an integrations 101. Really excited to jam with you all and get started. So kind of a little bit of a loose agenda of some of the major sections that wanted to cover today. Like Joshua mentioned, this is a sort of kind of like open session. So feel free to ask questions if you want to skip ahead to some other sections, hoping to make this a collaborative discussion, but there'll also be kind of like Q&A questions at the end as well. So yeah, kind of starting with the agenda. First, we'll go a little bit over my background. JT did a great job with that. What are integrations? How do you sort of like enable integrations and work with them in your organization or for the product that you're building? And then also want to touch on like the business of integrations and the API economy, because that gets me really jazzed. And I think there's a lot of underrated opportunities especially for indie founders, for no-code founders in that space. So a little bit about me. JT did a great job, but I'll just reiterate some points. I'm Lola. I run Lunch Pail Labs based out of Atlanta, Georgia. I call myself a low coder, started playing with WordPress and Shopify, but now I really love a lot of the newer tools, Bubble, Webflow, Airtable. I've created integrations for companies that have received like over thousands of downloads. I've also advised founders and software teams on their integration implementations, and love integration so much that I run an integration directory. So I feel like I've kind of really immersed myself in the space and just super jazzed to talk about this with you all. Now let's kind of level set with some just background knowledge so we're all on the same page. What are integrations? I think an easy way to define integrations, especially software integrations, is they're kind of like a bridge between two or more applications. And when you're integrating, you're usually exchanging functionality or information or data, and they can happen between a variety of different ways. APIs, I know APIs have started to get a lot of love in the no-code community, so that's been super exciting. But there's also connectors, custom code, and we'll cover some of the major types in the next slide. Here is a basic overview of some like major integration methods. You have like file-based, database, middleware, API, event-driven, native, which we'll also go more in depth with, but this is kind of like a high-level lay of the land. So we can maybe like pause there. I don't know if there have been any questions so far before we go into methods, or like keep going, but I can guess give it a 5-second pause in case if there are any, hey, I have a question here, or I want to hear about this.
Feel free to just come off mute and ask, or drop it in the chat if you have any questions.
All right, so cool. Sounds like I can continue mowing along. So first method we can talk about here is file-based integrations. In this method, you're really focused on exchanging information between systems using files like CSV or XML. This can be done manually or with automation. I feel like when I was more so in the WordPress days, like FTP, which is kind of like a file-based integration method, would come up a lot. I would have my HostGator and there would be like the FTP files. Sometimes there are even FTP services you can use externally, like FileZilla, ExpandDrive, and WinSCP. I feel like with a lot of the newer no-code tools, this doesn't come up as often, but it's worth noting. Then we got our database integrations. This method involves connecting different databases so that like the data stays up to date. It usually happens through a process called database replication, which is basically just the process of copying data from one database to another, and ETL, which is short for extract, transform, load, takes data from one system and moves it to another. Some of the main differences between these kind of like two smaller types is with ETL, you're also taking another step of like transforming and making sure the data is also formatted correctly. In terms of no code options for accomplishing this, I think two really cool integration tools in this space are Whalesync and Unito. Whalesync also had this like stellar state of the no code data sync 2022 report. So if like database integration is something that you're interested in, or you have multiple databases and you want to keep them in sync, those are like two really good solutions to look at. Then we've got our middleware integration. I feel like middleware is probably like the method that gets maybe like the most attention in the no code space, even though sometimes people don't necessarily know that they're using middleware. But the basic way to think about it is like a middleman solution that makes it easier to connect different systems. And there's two kinds. You have these enterprise service buses, and that's mostly going to be something you might consider if you're like a larger company, and an integration platform as a service. And those, our Zapiers, our Makes, our Trays, our lovely sort of no-code automation tools oftentimes fall into that iPaaS category. One thing to note between like what exactly is the difference between an ESB and an iPaaS: enterprise service buses, they're usually sort of managed and like on-premise and available on-premise. So like you can kind of have your own local instance. So that's kind of why it's probably more of like an enterprise, like bigger kind of business consideration. Whereas with iPaaS, the third-party provider and owner kind of manages the platform. So if you're using Zapier, you do not need to have to like sort of divert like resources to like manage like the Zapiers in your thing. Kind of like Zapier offloads a lot of the managing and monitoring and alerting for you. Next, we've got our API integrations. I feel like APIs have been getting a lot of love. It's short for application programming interfaces. And or you could use like SDKs, which I think of as essentially wrappers for APIs. They make them like easier to sort of consume, but you use them again to connect different systems and exchange data and functionality. Especially in no-code tools, they sometimes have their own abstraction for using APIs. So Bubble, for example, you got your API connector, which makes it easy to connect to any service through an API and really helps to extend what you can do in like platforms like Bubble. Then I think this is our second to last, we've got our event-driven integrations. Really, the way I like to think about it is, for the most part, these are webhooks. It's sending events from one system to another for processing. Some no-code tools like Zapier and even like Bubble kind of have this built in, where you can set up a webhook that will then trigger a bunch of other actions. But there's also like webhooks as a service tools, examples being Hosted Hooks and Svix, if you want to use it in like a more like expanded case. And then the last one I'll kind of overview and mention are native integrations. And native integrations, they can kind of encompass some of the other methods that we talked about, but the difference is they are built into the platform. So they're generally going to be the easiest to use, because whatever no-code tool you're using, they're specifically kind of built to work with that tool and built with that tool in mind. And you don't have to, it doesn't require like external like integrations or additional software typically to use. So these are your typical plugins, apps, and extensions. All right, so that's just kind of high level overview on just what are integrations. And in the next section, yeah, we can jam about enabling integrations, how to implement them, why you should implement them and think about them. Yeah. And yeah, if there are any questions at any time, feel free to unmute and holler.
I'd like to add, as someone spending most of his time doing PHP, everything you've said is relevant even in the no-code world. This is general good classification.
Oh, nice.
Even for no-code stuff.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, I feel like no code and low code and even code, they at their base have like a lot of the same sort of like technical concepts. So we're not as separated as it may seem, I feel like in like social media discussions. But yeah, no, thank you for that. That's awesome. And happy to have like a PHP developer in the audience. That is cool. I'll probably want to ask you some questions too.
Sure.
Nice. Wonderful, wonderful. So yeah, enabling integrations. First, let's start with kind of like why you should. And I think this GGV Capital, they published this report that they maintain. It's called the API First Index that really talks about the API economy. And they have this quote, says developers, but I think no code developers, if you're building software in any sort of shape or form, I think it counts. That really encapsulates like the idea behind choosing to integrate versus figuring something on by yourself. And I think, yeah, the core ethos there is it allows you to spend your time on the higher value work. So if something is not as high value, you likely want to find an integration for accomplishing that instead of wasting your time trying to build that from the ground up. And I think another sort of related point here that is not always on the forefront, it oftentimes enables a better product. Like SendGrid spends $1 billion+ every year trying to perfect how to send emails. If you try to figure out how to send emails yourself without that, it's likely, and you're not an email company, it may not be as good as a product as you could if you just chose to integrate. And with that, because I think it still can be sort of like vague and esoteric, like, oh, like what's the high value? What's the time consuming? I think this build versus buy sort of chart really encapsulates things that you can identify when you're building, where you should maybe think about an integration. And it's modified from a graphic called a Not Boring article from like that talks all about like APIs and the API economy. But basic idea here is if something is mission critical, but like you don't want to do it, then maybe you should look at an integration to do it. And further sort of figuring that out, like I think another really important idea here and big idea here is just this idea of like non-core and figuring out what non-core is in this 2x2. I love my charts and my matrices kind of helps with that as well. Looking at if something is really like the things that are of like high strategic importance and high like business operations importance are like the things that you need to build. Everything else you can really think about either eliminating. If it's not important at all, definitely don't do it, or integrating through a tool. And here I have the difference between like, I have a partnering versus outsourcing. Think if something is like of high like strategic importance to the business or the future of the business, you really, really want to vet like whatever integration or tool or API partner you want to use. Whereas if it's like low value, maybe it's high operational importance, things like what you use for logging in, like very high operational importance because your users will log in all the time, but it's not like something that's going to make you strategically different than any other app that you're building. You can more safely just sort of outsource. You may not want to really consider a partnership for that. Alrighty. So hopefully now like you've decided that, okay, cool. Integrations are cool. Maybe I should be even integrating with more services than I thought I should previously. How do you find them? Where do you find them? And I have these sort of three main areas where I typically look for integrations. API marketplaces and directories are a really great one. They oftentimes also have reviews or they're curated data sets, so you can be well assured that your integration is something that you can trust. And so for those, you have your integrations directory. Programmable web has a lot of really great APIs. So especially if you're comfortable with integrating through an API method, you can look at that. A lot of no-code tools now are extendable by APIs. And if they're not, there might be a middleware solution that you can use like Zapier or Tray that can connect those. Rapid API Hub is also another great one. And then for the no-code tools specifically, you have your app marketplaces. Especially, I think in the past couple of years, there's been a massive push with these tools, recognizing that they're not going to be able to serve every use case and build like every bit of functionality in-house. And so more of these tools are investing in their app ecosystems, encouraging sort of like third-party players to contribute so that folks can make use of different functionality and that their products can become stickier. So that's a really good one. And then communities and forums, finding a similar solution through there, throwing it up on a place like No Code Founders can also seed some tried and tested methods that you could use or integrations that you can try out. And then another important piece, once you've found your integration, how do you even know if it's any good? I really like to think about these sort of like 4 areas. Don't necessarily have to do them in order, but first thing, really check out the vendor. Do your research on the vendor of who's creating the solution to make sure that they have a good reputation, that they're even, especially I think in no code, a lot of like no code plugins and extensions, sometimes they'll be created by like an indie third-party maker, and they may not be like actively maintained anymore. You really want to sort of check that history or check out that tool before you spend too much of your time trying to make that tool or integration part of your stack. Because in some ways, it's kind of like hiring an employee. Like you're offloading this part of your business to this external service. So you want to do some vetting there. Then a quick test of the integration. I think one of the things that can quickly sort of uncover whether an integration is compatible is like how easily you can authenticate. So basically, like how easy is it for you to like accomplish your first task with the integration? How easily is it for you to just get started to connect to the service using API keys? And then another thing that I think can sometimes be overlooked, but it's important in this sort of arena, even for your no-code apps. And I'm really excited by companies like Switchboard that are specifically making like monitoring solutions for no-code. But another thing to sort of find out is like, how do you know when something stops working? How do you know if something breaks? Like, what sort of errors do they provide? What sort of alerts are there on the system? Is that something that you kind of have to set up with like triggers? Is there a different service that does have better monitoring and like logging in that sense? Another big area is also looking at costs and limits, especially as it scales. I have like worked with founders who sometimes get blindsided in some ways where, you know, the free plan might be really, really great. And they don't realize that, yeah, once their app starts getting usage, like this is kind of how, like, yeah, sort of the costs that are involved. And most of the time it's still worth it. And another sort of big piece of this as well are sort of like rate limits as well. Especially like some really popular no code tools, you can only make or really popular APIs. Sometimes you can only make so many requests. And so depending on how you're using it, you may not be able to use it as often as you need to. And even if you find that, okay, I'm starting an early version, it's not going to be the most infinitely scalable integration that I'm going to use when I'm on version 10 with a lot more users, that's totally cool, but just making sure that you kind of understand that. I think I heard somebody unmute. Any like questions or comments here? Or maybe I didn't.
I have a question if nobody else does. So I'm curious about the kind of breaking side of things. So I also used to use WordPress quite a lot, and WordPress was like very heavily reliant on loads of native integrations like widgets and things like this. And as soon as you did an upgrade or something, or one of the widgets got upgraded, everything would just break. And I wondered, in terms of the different kinds of integrations that you're talking about, like middleware and the native integrations, which is probably where I guess most no coders are going to be in those areas. What are the best options to protect against that breaking as things get updated, or a developer doesn't update their integration or something like that?
Ooh, that's a really great question. And in terms, so I think one cool thing about middleware solutions is a lot of the tools like Zapier, they'll be like Zapier alerts. So they kind of have built in these monitoring and logging. Native integrations, it can be a mixed bag because it really depends on how the third-party developer has set up the integration to share either errors, to like share errors when something goes wrong, not just to pretend that like the request was fulfilled, and set up things that way. Sometimes, I feel like it is a mixed bag, but one thing you can do, there are like external services, like you can build in checks, especially like in things like Bubble with solutions like Logsnag, even though that's not the like intended solution, you can have little fail-safe points of, oh, if this doesn't actually happen, I want to send like an email or an alert to myself. But sometimes they have to be sort of custom made flows if they're that important to what you're building. But a lot of like middleware and established company kind of integrations will have those monitoring and logging kind of built in. That's a great question, though.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And then, I think another pretty big consideration here is the documentation and support. I feel like it's just a telltale if like they don't have understandable documentation, if they don't have any documentation, even if you can try to figure it out, it's like a red flag of potential issues in the future if something does go wrong. And then also support, reaching out to the integration creators, using their helpline, really understanding if you do run into issues with the integration, who can you ask for help? Are they generally available, or is this like another situation where it is like a solution that isn't maintained? So main ones on evaluating integrations. So you find them, decide you want to do them, you evaluate them. And And so the past kind of couple of slides have really been about integrations to almost like enable functionality in your application. And I think there's like an underrated like integrations for growth for like acquiring customers, especially if you have a product that is serving other companies. There's a Profitwell study here that states that even just having at least like one integration for your customers to use, those products have up to a 15% higher retention and up to a 30% higher willingness to pay. So there's almost like a strategic benefit, and it's almost like a way to acquire new customers, make your products stickier by deciding to integrate and add integrations and have integrations like a big part, because we don't use apps in a silo. We're a very integrated ecosystem. We use tons of things, so making it easy to use with tons of other things kind of makes your product more valuable. And when you're looking at sort of integrations for growth or enabling integrations for your customers to use, as opposed to just like, oh, I need this functionality, so I'm going to have a payment processor, you have the similar sort of like two options. You can build it in-house, or you can buy a solution. Building in-house, that means you're going to use the integration methods that we sort of talked about. You're going to connect to your API. Maybe you'll use some middleware to make it happen. But there's also a growing subset of almost like integration as a service companies, where you can buy almost, especially I think it's really cool, embedded iPaaS, so embedded integration platforms as a service. Integree, Paragon are two examples of that, where you can, it's like a Zapier within your application that makes it easy for your customers to set up connections to like the software that they use. And then unified APIs, I also put that in the buy side, but the way to think about those is it's almost like a shortcut to integrating with multiple things. Usually you'll have a single API, and then you can integrate multiple accounts. Some really cool examples of that are Merge. You can, with one Merge integration, you can get like endpoints, or you can integrate to multiple accounting systems, multiple HR systems. Another really cool one is AirShare. It's a social media unified API. I think it's so brilliant. With one connection to AirShare, you can have connections to all of the social media sort of posting platforms. So if you want to enable your customers to post to LinkedIn and Twitter and YouTube and TikTok, you can do that like through one API, as opposed to making those connections yourself. Pros of the build in-house, you're really going to want that if you're looking at a truly like custom flow, better for really custom integration use cases, and you'll have more control of just the experience. But cons is, integrations can take some time, more time than if you just buy a solution. I feel like a lot of these pros and cons are also just like the pros and cons of no code in general. So yeah, final section here. Really want to just touch on like the business of integrations. But before I move on, anybody have any comments or additions? Does anybody use integrations for growth in their apps, like things that they do? Would be happy to hear from folks if they have anything.
GL, you're off mute. You got a question? Doesn't seem like it.
Oh, no worries. Yeah, soon we'll finish up, and then I can jump into the actual space, because I can't see you all from here. But so yeah, final thing, we can just talk about the business of integrations, the API economy, and the opportunity for founders. And I'll throw out some stats here. First is just like API first companies are getting a lot of funding. I think the way to think about API first, it's almost a subset of SaaS in general, software as a service, but in an API first company, their primary product is like functionality or like an API that other people use. And in Q3 of 2022 alone, these companies raised $350 million. So even in this wild, I guess, economy that we're experiencing, they're growing and they're getting a lot of attention. But it's not only for, so just a overall third-party API economy sort of map. It's really interesting because some of these also mentioned here, I would consider no-code tools like Zapier, Tray, Shopify. And so I feel like there's a lot of overlap / no code in some ways is a subset because there's so many like similar ethos there. But, this API economy, usually building APIs can be a very technical endeavor. I will mention at the end some tools that you can use to build APIs without code if you wanted to create an API. The platforms themselves are creating mini economies. So 2020 couldn't find the most recent numbers, but Shopify's partners generated 12.5 billion in revenue. That's 4 times the revenue that Shopify was making at the time. And that does include things like people who also create templates and provide services. But just goes to say that as these platforms become behemoths, there's a large opportunity, I think, for micro SaaS founders to also build on their platforms and get noticed. And it's not just Shopify. I've been really interested for some of these other platforms, kind of what else is on there, how many users they have, and kind of the size of their plugins and apps. And you'll see that a lot of newer platforms are, even in the past 10 years, did not even exist 10 years ago. So WordPress, I just put that there as the behemoth. Lots of big businesses built on WordPress, especially WeCommerce. I think they do $28 million a year, but tons of users, tons of plugins and apps. Shopify, which I think is starting to get a lot more attention as a place to sort of build businesses. Also a lot of users, quite a few apps. And then there's some that are just mind-bogglingly tiny, even though they have quite a few users. A lot of the reason being that they're super new, but Webflow, they only have 21 apps currently listed on their app marketplace. Bubble is pretty big, 2,500, 2 million users. Adalo recently launched, couple 100,000, but only 100 sort of competitors and things. And so all to say that we're just at the beginning of this integration business. I think we're going to see more modularity and more opportunity for people who are just selling pieces that people can rent and put into their applications. So it's a kind of cool time and space to be. And lastly, if you're interested in building integrations to sell, you don't have to be super technical. The platforms themselves, kind of how I've mentioned earlier, are really supporting folks who are building integrations on their building and extending their platform. I didn't list it in the state of the app marketplaces, but Coda, when they launch, I think they might have launched 2021 or 2022 with their PAX marketplace. They even had a grant for people that people could use to build interesting packs for the Coda community. So they usually have support that they offer, abstractions to make it easier for people who may not necessarily be super technical, starter templates, and a lot of resources. Then there are a budding group of no-code tools that you can use to build APIs and extensions that you can sell, not even through a marketplace, but just in general. Zano and Craftar, which is relatively new. I think it's crafter.io is the domain. 2 good tools to check out in that regard. And last one that I think is also kind of a little underrated are spreadsheets and curated data sets. So if there's some information that you've got a long list of, you can sell access to that as an API. And there are a ton of sheet to API tools where, if you've got something in Google Sheets or Excel, people can pay usage-based to use that information in their apps. And I know that was a whirlwind of tons of information of me kind of spewing a lot of stuff, but really that's, the main sort of things I have around integrations. I'll make the slides. I'll see if I can make the slides available to folks after too. So if you want that as a resource to keep and check out, you can. And yeah, you know, I'm on Twitter, I'm on LinkedIn. And so I can, I guess, go back to wherever everybody is inside the chats.
Thank you. That was so interesting. I had no idea it was so complex. Now I feel like I know nothing. There's a question here from Ryan in the chat. He's asking, do you have some resources to assess the adoption rate stroke maturity of integration providers?
In terms of integration providers like your Zapiers, or in terms of like integrations you're trying to find, or like if you see an API or native integration?
In terms of comparing different providers of APIs or services.
That's a great question. I feel like that would actually be an awesome tool. I haven't come across any tools for like assessing that. But yeah, I feel like that would be very, very helpful. Definitely make the research easier.
StackShare is one that I'm aware of that compares the technical stack of different companies, what they use. You have to pay to subscribe to get all the details for those, but that's kind of a popular one. And I figured maybe that was a softball question too, now that come to think of it, because you run a directory.
Oh yeah, I guess, yeah. The directory could use that, but StackShare is cool. StackShare is cool. I guess in my mind, I was thinking of something, I'll definitely like note StackShare, like something a little bit more like involved, but yeah. Definitely you can check out integrations directory, StackShare, Rapid API Hub. They will have like reviews and rate. A lot of the marketplaces too, they will enable reviews. So that can be an easy way. When things stop working, people will be like, this person doesn't even maintain this anymore. And it's like very sad, but yeah.
Thanks, Lola.
Yeah, thanks.
Does anyone else have any questions in the audience?
Thank you for the presentation, Lola. A quick question. Are we going to get access to the recording? I joined late, so sorry, I missed most of the presentation. Can we get access to the recording?
I think so. I guess.
It is being recorded, so I'll be sharing that in tomorrow's newsletter if you're subscribed to that. Are you subscribed to that? If not, you can send me your email address in the chat and I can send it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. I think I'm subscribed. I'll send it to you just to be double sure. Thank you, Lola. This is great.
Yeah, thanks for joining. Always excited to jam.
Are there any more questions? Any questions, anybody? If not, we can wrap up a little early. And 2 more people have just joined the event though. Thanks for the email address, Yemi. I'll send it over to you. Welcome, Enrique and Gregory. We're just about to wrap up. Do you have any questions that you wanted to ask Lola before we go?
Hey, how's it going? Sorry about that. Yeah, I was in and out. I was traveling, but the conversation still seemed pretty interesting. You guys were going over native integrations last time. I got cut off. I was in the train. But I guess maybe my only question is maybe what are some of the top platforms that have the most like native integrations out there? Because obviously that's the way to go when you're building an MVP, is using lots of integrations to lower the amount of code or work that you have to do. So I'm just curious, like, what are the most cost-effective platforms out there I work for a platform as well, actually. So I'm always just curious about what our competitors are doing. So that's a little selfish on my end, but yeah, so I'm just curious.
Nice. Oh yeah, no, that's a really great question. And I'll see if I can like also include the slides when JT shares the recording. But I did share kind of like a sort of state of the app marketplaces. And in terms, it really depends to kind of like what the use case is, because every platform won't be able to accurately help with every sort of software use case. But Shopify, I think, has emerge as like a leader in terms of having a lot of native options, oftentimes paid, but still native for kind of integrating with other tools and indie developers. And I think people interested in like Microsoft and even bigger companies are really looking at that platform to build integrations. Bubble
Right.
has a ton, though it's not always like the most well supported, but there's over like 2,500 Bubble plugins. And quite a ton of users as well. I think some platforms will like quickly catch up. Webflow just officially launched their app marketplace at the end of last year, and they only have like 21 apps on there. So it's very small, but I can imagine people being drawn to that platform to continue to build once they, I think, promote it more. So I see that as being a good opportunity as well.
Cool. Yeah, I'm super familiar with Bubble, the Bubble platform, because we have a full stack no code platform that has integrations inside it. But I think some of the main considerations I've learned with integrations and some of our customers is you might be able to integrate, but how extensive and how robust is the integration and how far it can go, right? And I think that's kind of has to do with your roadmap for what you're trying to build. So, and that's another criteria of like figuring out like, okay, this has the integration, but does it do all the things, or does the platform have all the things that I need for the next operating cost of a year or two? And if that's a yes, that's generally a pretty good decision to make if you're building an MVP. But if you're building something more long-term, you want to be able to have more control over the code and flexibility of what you're doing. So, but no, that's interesting. I mean, Shopify is a huge one, of course, and but I guess I'm thinking more in the full stack app development space and integrations.
Yeah, that's a great one. Yeah, I feel like web apps, Bubble is probably really big there. I'm super curious though. I mean, if you don't mind sharing, like what's the no code tool that you work with?
I'm head of I've been building the commercial model for this group called Didify, and it's a full stack app development platform. The front end develops React code. The back end develops Google Go code. You can export both code bases. You can build the back end and the front end independently of one another. So if you have back end experience, you can build out a back end and put on any type of front end. So you can actually put a Webflow front end on a back end of a Google Go. But from an integration standpoint, you can integrate. It's basically like coding, but you're using auto code generation. And we're building more in the box integrations. And I was hoping to be here for longer to learn which integrations everybody wanted so that we can build more of them. So we integrate with Postman, we integrate with Stripe, of course, we integrate with HubSpot, we integrate with all these different providers. But I think in the no code, low code space, like, the more integrations you have, the more valuable you can be, because that basically means people do work faster and they can start pushing data around quicker. But yeah, we're called Didify, and most of the companies that use us are startups or they're individuals that can't afford to hire a full engineering team to build their product. And they learn how to use our product, and they can have full control over the code base, so they can export it and put it wherever they like. So there's no vendor lock-in like Bubble, there's no vendor lock-in like Shopify or anything like that. You can actually run the code on your own infrastructure if you wanted to, and like at any point. So or you can use our infrastructure as well. So
oh, that's super solid. Yeah, no, I'm glad you mentioned it, and I'm excited to like explore Didify more. Yeah, I think these like sort of like newer generation of tools where you can keep the code, like Flutterflow seems like a cool one in that space as well. But yeah, nice. And it sounds like you all have the core ones, because every app for the most part will need like a payment processing. Sounds like y'all got that covered. So that's cool.
Right. And ours mostly plays to like high velocity kind of back end. So we work with a lot of like data streaming companies where they have to stream lots of data, and usually with more of the in the box integrations, the data requirements for more in the like, you know, Shopify and like Bubble, you have to pay lots of money to be able to process lots of data in the back end generally. But for ours, you can build a pretty slim system and process lots of data there. So we're data kind of nerds in that regard, but I'm always just interested in hearing from the communities what people like really care about and what they want. So
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry I got caught up on the train. So
Oh, no, super cool. I'm excited.
All right.
I love hearing about new tools.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Gregory. Does anyone else have any questions?
I have one actually question related to the community. How often do you guys have these types of discussions? This is one of my first time attending. So.
Good question. So they're not on a fixed cadence. So recently we've been doing 1 or 2 a week, but then sometimes we have them less often. So it just depends. We do workshops, webinars, networking sessions. So all kinds of different things going on all the time. Yeah. If you're subscribed to the newsletter, then we share details on that
Okay.
each week. So we'll be sharing today's recording tomorrow in tomorrow's newsletter.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, no worries. So if there's no more questions, last call for questions. If not, then we can say thank you to Lola. And really appreciate the time, Lola, and going through those slides. Once again, my mind is blown, and I'll need to rewatch it, I think, to take it in. But appreciate you walking us through that today. And if you're not subscribed to the newsletter, then do that, and you can see the recording tomorrow. And other than that, I'll just say thanks to everyone for coming, and see you in the next one. Right, thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Great. Thanks, y'all.